Most people think chaos in life comes from laziness or lack of discipline, but that's usually not what actually happens. More often, life falls into chaos when the structure that held it together disappears. A relationship ends, you lose a job, someone betrays you, someone you love dies, or the future that you built your entire identity around suddenly collapses. And there's often a quiet thought in the background of your mind. There's so many things that I should fix, but I don't even know where to begin. What many people experience here is not simply pain, it's disorientation. The structure that organized your life is gone, and the mind suddenly finds itself standing in a reality that no longer feels familiar. When life collapses like this, the mind often responds in a predictable way. It enters something like the global repair mode. Instead of focusing on one specific problem, the mind scans the entire structure of life: work, health, relationship, finances, purpose, everything. And everything suddenly feels like it must be solved right now, immediately. Human life does not reorganize all at once. It reorganizes through small actions interacting with reality. And when everything feels broken simultaneously, the mind often freezes because the scale of the problem feels impossible. Life is held together by structures that we rarely notice. Daily routines, responsibilities, physical environments. These things, they act like framework of a building. They give shape to our days, and as long as that framework exists, life feels stable. But when enough of those supports disappear, life loses its shape, not just emotionally, but practically. The day begins without clear direction, and without structure, the minds become disoriented. Human beings rely heavily on repetition, right? Because repetition reduces the uncertainty in our lives. A morning routine, a workplace, people we regularly see, responsibilities we regularly handle, these things, they function as anchors. They quietly tell the mind where it is in the day and what comes next. And when those anchors disappear, the mind must constantly improvise. What should I do now? Where should I start? Right? And over time, constant improvisation becomes exhausting. And here's where avoidance begins to grow. When life feels disorganized, many people begin postponing certain responsibilities. They forget to answer a message, right? They delay a task, they avoid certain conversations, and at first, these things seem small, right? We're protecting our peace, but the mind does not forget unresolved problems. Each unfinished responsibility becomes a small, unresolved piece of reality. And as they accumulate, something changes. A quiet background pressure begins forming. You may recognize the feeling, the sense that there's something in your life that needs attention, which leads us to attention becoming fragmented. As unresolved problems accumulate, attention becomes unstable. Instead of focusing on one task, the mind jumps between concerns: work, health, relationships, finances, everything that we have discussed so far, every little detail about your life. And each one briefly demands attention. But because there are too many of them, the mind cannot stay with any single one long enough to resolve it. So attention fragments. And when attention fragments, progress becomes difficult. Even simple tasks, like we said, they start feeling overwhelming because the mind is already carrying too many unresolved things, which leads us to the final stage when chaos reaches identity. If this continues long enough, something deeper begins to change. At first, the problem feels practical, right? My routines are falling apart. But eventually, the interpretation shifts. The mind begins asking a more painful question: why can't I keep my life together? And at this point, chaos becomes dangerous because the problem stops being about routines. It becomes a confusion about the self. People begin losing trust in their own decisions. They promise themselves things will change tomorrow, but tomorrow arrives and the promise disappears. Over time, a thought appears that many people rarely say out loud: maybe something is wrong with me. But I want to suggest another possibility hidden inside of these experiences. Sometimes chaos appears because the structure that once organized your life can no longer hold. And when structure disappears, chaos naturally follows. This doesn't mean that the person is incapable of building order, it just means that the life that they were standing on no longer exists. Before new structure forms, there's often a period where everything feels unstable, an in between period. Not the old life and not the new one. Now, obviously, there are psychological consequences. Living in this state changes how life feels and the way you interact with life. Confidence becomes fragile because confidence does not come only from believing in yourself. Confidence comes from seeing your action create order in reality. When actions stop producing visible order, trust in yourself begins to fade. Relationships can also suffer, not intentionally, but because chaos consumes attention. You're never present with your partner or with your friends or with your family. When the mind is constantly managing internal disorder, it has less capacity to be present with others. Even emotions shift. Small problems feel heavier, like we said, decisions feel harder, and everything feels just so much more complicated. And that's really just caused by too many unresolved fragments. Modern life, unfortunately, can intensify this experience. We live surrounded by constant input, messages, information, comparison. There's also a cultural pressure to constantly improve productivity, habits, reinvent ourselves. And this creates the illusion that life should always move forward smoothly. So when chaos appears, people assume that something is deeply wrong. But periods of disorder have always been part of human life. Even ancient stories reflect this pattern. In the story of Joseph, for example, his life appears to collapse completely. He is betrayed by his brothers, he is sold into slavery, he is falsely accused, he is thrown into prison, and from the inside, his life must have looked completely broken, right? The structure of his world had collapsed totally. Yet later, the story reveals something surprising, that chaos was real, right? But it was not meaningless. And that pattern appears again and again and again in human life. Moments where everything feels disordered until much later, its structure becomes visible. People often look for a dramatic solution, a complete reset, a sudden transformation, a moment where everything finally comes back together. But rebuilding life rarely happens this way. When the structure of life collapses, it cannot be rebuilt all at once. It begins somewhere much, much smaller. With the reintroduction of structure into a single day. Waking up at the same time each morning, you clean a small part of your environment. Yeah, none of those actions will solve your life, but they do something extremely important. They begin rebuilding the structure of reality around you. And structure does something powerful to the human mind. It restores orientation. When the day has shape again, the mind slowly regains stability. Then one responsibility leads to another. One ordered day makes the next day easier. And gradually, the chaos that once felt overwhelming begins losing its hold. Because in the end, order in life is never permanent. It is something that we continually rebuild, responsibility by responsibility, action by action, day by day. And when chaos appears, it does not necessarily mean your life is over. Sometimes it simply means that the structure that once held your life together has fallen apart and a new one is waiting to be built.